200 Marines stood in perfect dress blues, ready to cut the birthday cake with a ceremonial sword, when the ceiling of the ballroom cracked open like an egg. Nobody in that room had trained for this. Nobody in the galaxy had trained for this. Because in the next 10 seconds, an alien invasion fleet was about to learn the one lesson every enemy of the Marine Corps eventually learns the hard way. If you smash a formal military ceremony, you do not get scared humans. You get humans in their sharpest uniforms, holding real swords, and already annoyed about their evening. Stick around, hit that like button, subscribe if you want more of this madness, and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. Because this story is about to move fast, and you do not want to miss a second of it. Camp Hearthstone sat quiet under a clear November sky, and for one night a year, the base stopped looking like a battlefield and started looking like a wedding nobody wanted to admit they enjoyed. The Marine Corps Birthday Ball was the one event where drill instructors put down their clipboards, corporals ironed creases sharp enough to cut paper, and even the meanest gunnery sergeant on base allowed himself one dance with his wife before pretending it never happened. Second platoon sat at table 14, dressed in their formal blues, looking like men who had been folded into their own uniforms with a shoehorn. Corporal Miller adjusted his collar for the 5th time in 10 minutes. "I liberated a planet 3 weeks ago," Miller muttered. "This collar is worse than the aliens." Private Simmons leaned over, grinning under a haircut so fresh it still looked offended. "Corporal, you look sharp. I look strangled." Across the table, Diaz straightened his medals, like a man arranging trophies he still could not believe he owned. Briggs sat beside him, quietly reading the ceremony program like it was a tactical briefing. Kowalski had already found the dessert table with his eyes and was calculating distance and travel time. At the head table, Lieutenant Harris sat upright, clipboard nowhere in sight, though everyone suspected he had one hidden somewhere in his jacket out of pure instinct. Sergeant Malone sat beside him, arms crossed, sipping coffee from a mug that had clearly not been approved for formal wear. The ceremony began the way it always did. The oldest Marine present and the youngest Marine present stood at the front of the room, ready to share the first and second pieces of birthday cake, a tradition that had survived wars, weather, and at least one accidental building fire in 1987. A polished Mameluke sword rested across the cake table, gleaming under the lights, ceremonial, decorative, and about to become the least ceremonial object in the entire star system. Colonel Whitfield, the base commander, stepped up to the podium. He was the kind of man who looked like he had been carved out of granite and then handed a dress uniform as an afterthought. His voice carried across the room with the calm authority of someone who had given this same speech a dozen times and meant every word a little more each year. 251 years, Whitfield said. 251 years of Marines showing up when nobody else would. The room applauded. Miller clapped along, already thinking about how fast he could loosen his collar the second the lights dimmed for the toast. Then the lights did dim, but not for the toast. They flickered first, a small stutter that most people in the room dismissed as an electrical hiccup. Malone did not dismiss it. His eyes moved to the ceiling before anyone else's did, tracking a low hum that had no business existing inside a ballroom. "Harris," Malone said quietly, not moving his head. "You feel that?" Harris frowned. "Feel what?" The chandeliers rattled. Glasses on every table trembled in place, spreading small circles across the wine no one had touched yet. Somewhere near the back doors, an unfamiliar tone rang out, deep and rhythmic, like something enormous was clearing its throat above the building. Colonel Whitfield paused mid-sentence, the confidence in his voice cracking for the first time all evening. If this is the Honor Guard's cannon salute early, someone is getting extra duty. It was not the Honor Guard. The ceiling above the center of the ballroom split open with a shriek of tearing metal and falling plaster, and through that gap dropped a beam of pale blue light, wide enough to swallow 3 tables whole. Dust rained down onto white tablecloths. Somewhere, a string quartet's cello let out one confused, dying note before the musician dropped his bow entirely. For one long second, nobody in dress blues moved. Then a shape descended through the light, armored, tall, and unmistakably not human, boots landing on the polished dance floor with a heavy metallic clang that echoed through the stunned silence of 200 formally dressed United States Marines. Miller looked at Simmons. Simmons looked at Miller. Neither of them reached for a weapon, because neither of them had one. Ceremonial swords did not count as combat load, and every rifle on base was locked up exactly where regulations demanded they be during a formal event. Malone stood up, slowly, coffee still in hand, and said the only sentence that mattered. "Well," he said, "this is new." The alien figure straightened to its full height, scanning the room through a dark visor, clearly expecting panic, chaos, maybe screaming. Instead, it found 200 men and women in dress uniforms staring back at it, with the specific, deeply personal annoyance of people whose one night off had just been ruined. Then, from somewhere near the back of the room, a voice broke the silence. "Sir," Kowalski said, cake fork still in hand, "do we still get dessert first?" Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. And high above the ballroom, through the torn ceiling, the shape of a second ship began to descend into view. The alien commander's translator crackled to life, its voice low and mechanical, echoing off the marble floor of the ballroom. Ceremonial gathering detected. Weapons minimal. Resistance unlikely. Malone set his coffee down on the table with the careful precision of a man who had decided something important. "Somebody go tell that thing it just insulted 200 Marines." Colonel Whitfield stepped down from the podium, his voice steady despite the chaos above him. "This is a private event. You have 3 seconds to explain yourselves before things get significantly worse for you." The alien tilted its head, clearly running the words through translation. "Threat assessment error. Correcting." More shapes dropped through the widening hole in the ceiling. 6, then 10. Armored troopers in dark plating that matched the description every veteran in that room had heard before during briefings on the Jakari Dominion. Word spread through the tables in urgent whispers. "That's Jakari armor," Briggs said, gripping the edge of the table. "They followed us home," Diaz muttered. "They actually followed us home." Hafris, still without his clipboard, straightened his jacket and stepped forward with the kind of instinct that no manual ever fully explained. "This is a formal military ceremony," he announced. "You are currently trespassing on a United States Marine Corps installation." The lead Jakari trooper studied him. "Human. You wear ceremonial plumage. You are not combat ready." Harris blinked. "This is a dress uniform. You carry no weapon. I carry a ceremonial sword." The trooper's visor flickered, processing. "Decorative, non-threatening." From table 14, Miller stood up, jaw tight, eyeing the untouched Mameluke sword still resting on the cake table only a few feet away. He had spent the last 3 weeks disabling an entire occupation grid with an alien plumbing tool. He was not about to be told a Marine sword was decorative. "Careful," Malone said under his breath, though there was the faintest hint of a smile behind the warning. Kowalski, meanwhile, had quietly slid 2 steps closer to the dessert table, eyeing both the cake and the nearest exit with equal seriousness. The Jakari commander raised a weapon, a long emitter rifle that hummed with charging energy, and pointed it directly at Colonel Whitfield. "You will identify yourselves as Dominion property or be neutralized." Whitfield did not flinch. "I am the commanding officer of this installation, and you have exactly 1 more sentence before I stop being polite." The rifle's charge grew louder. That was the exact moment Miller moved. He crossed the distance to the cake table in 3 fast steps, grabbed the ceremonial sword by its polished hilt, and swung it upward in 1 clean motion, knocking the rifle barrel skyward just as it fired. The blast tore through the ballroom ceiling instead of the colonel, showering sparks and plaster across nearby tables. Screams erupted, chairs scraped back, and 200 formally dressed Marines finally did what training told them to do even without weapons in hand. They moved. Diaz grabbed a serving tray and slammed it into the nearest trooper's helmet like a cymbal crash. Briggs tackled another trooper into the chocolate fountain, sending warm brown syrup spraying across white tablecloths and dark Jakari armor alike. Simmons grabbed 2 chairs and held them like a lion tamer, herding confused guests toward the side exits. Malone, still holding his coffee mug in one hand, calmly threw the scalding contents directly into the visor of the nearest Jakari soldier, who staggered backward, clutching his face and making a sound that translated roughly into several very unhappy syllables. "Command grade," Malone said simply, setting the empty mug down like he had just finished a routine morning briefing. Colonel Whitfield straightened his jacket, unbothered by the chaos, and turned to face the shocked Jakari commander directly. "You picked the wrong ballroom." The commander raised his rifle again, but Miller was already moving, sword raised, boots sliding across a dance floor slick with spilled champagne and chocolate syrup, closing the distance before the enemy could fire a second shot. Miller crossed the last few feet at a dead sprint, the ceremonial sword catching the light of the shattered chandeliers above him. The Jakari commander barely had time to shift his aim before Miller's shoulder slammed into his chest plate, driving him backward into an overturned table. The rifle clattered away, sliding beneath a row of collapsed chairs. "You picked the wrong cake," Miller said. Around them, the ballroom had turned into something between a battlefield and the world's strangest bar fight. Diaz ducked a plasma blast that scorched a hole clean through a floral centerpiece, then answered by flipping an entire dessert table onto two advancing troopers, burying them under a landslide of cupcakes and shattered glass bowls. "That is for insulting my dress shoes," Diaz shouted. Briggs, still soaked head to toe in chocolate fountain syrup, had picked up a serving tray shield in each hand and was using them to deflect blaster fire with the calm focus of a man who had clearly decided this was now a completely normal Tuesday. Every impact sent a small shower of sparks and chocolate droplets into the air. Simmons had herded a group of stunned junior officers and their families toward a side exit, using an overturned buffet cart as a makeshift barricade. "Move, move, we've got this," he shouted, though the tremble in his voice suggested he was mostly saying it to convince himself. At the center of it all, Sergeant Malone walked through the chaos with the unbothered pace of a man taking an evening stroll, occasionally redirecting a Jakari trooper's aim with nothing more than a well-placed shove or a thrown ice bucket. Somewhere along the way, he had acquired a second mug of coffee, and nobody dared ask how. Colonel Whitfield had moved the moment the fighting started, not away from danger, but toward the base intercom mounted near the ballroom entrance. His voice thundered through the speakers a moment later, calm, deep, and absolutely furious. "All units, general quarters. Hostile forces on base during the birthday ball." I say again, hostile forces have interrupted the cake. Somewhere across camp, a duty officer nearly dropped his radio in disbelief. Back on the ballroom floor, Miller pinned the Jakari commander against the wreckage of the overturned table, sword pressed lightly against the alien's collar seal.
"Where's the rest of your fleet?" The commander's translator crackled, defiant despite the situation. "Reinforcements inbound. This colony world belongs to the Dominion now." Miller almost laughed.
"This isn't a colony world. This is a parking lot with a flagpole." Above them, through the torn ceiling, a second and much larger shape began descending, engines glowing a deep, threatening red, casting long shadows across the wrecked ballroom floor. Every Marine still standing looked up at once. Harris, breathing hard, wiped chocolate syrup from his sleeve and turned toward Whitfield. "Sir, that's not a scout ship." "No," Whitfield said grimly, watching the shadow grow larger through the gap in the ceiling. "That is a boarding cruiser." Kowalski, who had somehow survived the entire opening skirmish while still holding a slice of birthday cake in one hand, looked up at the descending ship, then down at his cake, then back up again. "Sir," he said, "permission to finish this first." Nobody answered him, because at that exact moment, the boarding cruiser's landing ramp tore open the far wall of the ballroom, and a wave of fresh Jakari troopers marched through the gap in tight formation, weapons raised, straight into a room full of Marines who were, for the first time all evening, finally ready for them. The wall gave way in a shower of brick and plaster, and through the gap marched a full Jakari boarding company, weapons raised, formation tight, boots striking the marble floor in perfect mechanical rhythm. At the front walked a figure in heavier command armor, gold trim catching the light, clearly someone who considered himself important. Colonel Whitfield stepped forward to meet him, jacket still buttoned, expression unreadable. "You have some nerve interrupting a Marine Corps birthday." The Jakari officer's translator responded with cold precision. "This world falls under Dominion reclamation. Surrender your forces." Behind Whitfield, 2nd Platoon fanned out across what remained of the ballroom floor, using overturned tables as cover, chairs as improvised barricades, and in Kowalski's case, an entire dessert cart as a rolling shield. Miller stood at the center, ceremonial sword still in hand, chest heaving from the fight moments before. "Sir," Miller said quietly to Whitfield, "permission to not surrender." Whitfield's jaw tightened into something close to a smile. Permission granted, Corporal. The Jakari officer raised one armored hand, and his entire company opened fire at once. Blaster bolts tore through crystal chandeliers and marble columns, scorched black lines across white linen, and shattered the last of the ballroom's tall windows. Marines scattered behind cover with practice speed, formal shoes sliding across a floor slick with spilled champagne, melted ice sculpture, and chocolate syrup. Malone crouched behind an overturned serving cart, calmly reloading a captured Jakarsi sidearm he had lifted off an unconscious trooper earlier. "Command," he said into his radio, voice as steady as ever. "We are going to need every available unit at the ballroom, and somebody bring real weapons, preferably before the toast." Diaz popped up from behind a collapsed table, hurling a full ice bucket directly into an advancing trooper's face, buying Briggs enough time to drag a wounded junior officer's wife to safety behind the bar. Simmons, out of better options, had grabbed a fire extinguisher from the kitchen entrance and was using it like an improvised weapon, blasting freezing white spray directly into the visors of two confused Jakari soldiers. "It burns," one of them shouted through his translator, stumbling blindly into a wall. "It's carbon dioxide," Simmons yelled back. "It does not burn. You're just bad at this." At the center of the storm, Miller moved through the chaos with the sword raised, deflecting one blaster shot after another off the polished blade, sparks flying with every impact. It should not have worked. Ceremonial swords were not designed for this. And yet somehow impossibly, it kept working, because Miller had already decided he was not losing a fight in a rented tuxedo. The Jakari officer watched the chaos unfold with visible disbelief, his perfectly disciplined boarding company being dismantled piece by piece by men in formal jackets and shushin shoes. He raised his weapon toward Whitfield directly, done negotiating. "Enough," the officer barked. "The commanding officer dies first." Whitfield did not step back. He simply reached down, picked up the closest object within reach, a heavy brass ceremonial bell used to mark the changing of watch, and hurled it directly into the officer's chest with the force of a man who had clearly thrown a shot, put or two in his younger years. The officer staggered backward, armor denting under the impact, weapon firing wildly into the ceiling instead of at the colonel. Miller seized the opening instantly, closing the distance and driving the flat of the sword hard into the back of the officer's knee joint, dropping him to the marble floor with a heavy metallic thud. For one breathless moment, the entire ballroom seemed to hold still, the boarding company frozen at the sight of their commanding officer face down on a dance floor, defeated not by starfighters or heavy artillery, but by a birthday bell and a ceremonial sword. Then, from somewhere above the ballroom, through the gaping hole in the ceiling, a deep and unmistakable engine roar began to build, growing louder with every passing second.
And every Marine still standing looked up in unified dread at exactly what was coming down next.
The roar above the ballroom did not belong to another Jakari ship. It belonged to something far louder, far heavier, and unmistakably familiar to anyone who had served with 2nd Platoon over the last several weeks. Through the torn ceiling, a hulking shape descended, engines glowing warm orange instead of hostile red, landing struts extending as it settled onto the shattered remains of the dance floor, with a controlled, almost gentle touch that felt strangely polite for something the size of a small building. Diaz's face lit up first. "Is that Big Deborah?" Briggs finished, grinning through a face streaked with chocolate syrup and plaster dust. The captured Dominion transport's side hatch dropped open, and a voice crackled through its external speakers, warm, proud, and completely unbothered by the fact that it had just crashed a formal military ceremony through the roof. "Big Deborah requests permission to assist," the ship announced. Colonel Whitfield, still catching his breath beside the fallen Jakari officer, looked up at the enormous vehicle now occupying most of what used to be the dessert table. "Permission granted," he said, because at this point, arguing with a sentient alien transport felt like a losing battle nobody had time for. From the open hatch rolled two smaller captured skimmers, engines humming with what could only be described as enthusiasm, immediately taking defensive positions on either side of the ballroom entrance. The remaining Jakari boarding troops froze mid-advance, weapons wavering as they stared at their own stolen equipment, now actively working against them. "That is not possible," one trooper stammered through his translator. Those units belonged to the Dominion. Kowalski, cake plate somehow still balanced in one hand, leaned toward the nearest confused soldier. They switched teams. Better morale on our side. The remaining Jakari forces regrouped near the shattered far wall, weapons raised in a final defensive line, clearly unwilling to retreat, without at least attempting to salvage the mission. Their reserve commander, a broad armored figure with twin emitter blades, stepped forward through the wreckage, translator snapping with cold fury. "This ends now, humans." Miller stepped up beside Whitfield, sword still in hand, chest heaving, uniform torn at the shoulder but otherwise standing tall. "You said that already. Didn't work the first time either." The reserve commander charged, blades igniting with a sharp electric hum, moving fast across the debris-covered floor. Miller met him head-on, sword clashing against twin blades in a shower of sparks that lit up the wrecked ballroom like fireworks. Malone flanked from the side, driving a captured rifle butt into the commander's exposed side joint, while Dizes and Briggs closed in from the opposite angle, forcing the alien into a position with nowhere left to retreat. The fight lasted less than a minute, brutal, fast, and decisive, ending with the reserve commander flat on his back, disarmed, surrounded on all sides by Marines in formal dress uniforms who looked significantly less formal than they had an hour earlier. Outside, through the broken windows, the sound of incoming reinforcement vehicles finally reached the ballroom, headlights sweeping across the lawn as base security and combat units arrived in force, several minutes too late to actually help, but just in time to witness the aftermath. Colonel Whitfield straightened his torn jacket, looked out at the wrecked ballroom, the scattered cake, the chocolate-covered troopers zip-tied along the far wall, and Big Deborah sitting proudly where the string quartet used to perform, and let out a long, tired breath. "Somebody," he said, "go find out if the cake survived." It had not. But as the last Jakari troopers were marched out in restraints, and 2nd Platoon slowly regrouped near the wreckage of Table 14, nobody in that room doubted one thing. Whatever the Dominion had expected to find at a Marine Corps birthday ball, it had definitely not expected this. By midnight, the ballroom looked less like a battlefield and more like the world's strangest cleanup crew had been let loose on it. Medical teams moved between tables, checking for injuries. Base security walked the last of the restrained Jakari prisoners out through the shattered far wall, and somewhere near the kitchen entrance, a very confused catering staff member kept asking if the open bar was still technically active. Colonel Whitfield stood near the center of the room, surveying the damage with the calm patience of a man who had already decided this story would follow him for the rest of his career, whether he liked it or not. Beside him, Big Deborah powered down slowly, engines fading into a low contented hum, clearly pleased with herself. "You did good," Whitfield said, patting the transport's hull like he would a loyal horse. "Big Deborah agrees," the ship replied. 2nd Platoon gathered near what remained of Table 14, uniforms torn, chocolate-stained, and thoroughly exhausted. Miller finally set the ceremonial sword down on the one surviving section of tablecloth, staring at it like it had personally betrayed him by working so well. "I'm going to have to explain this in a report," Miller muttered. "You're going to have to explain a lot of things," Malone said, sipping from a third mug of coffee that had appeared from absolutely nowhere. Simmons, still holding the now empty fire extinguisher like a trophy, looked around at the wreckage with something close to pride. "Corporal, we saved the birthday ball." "We destroyed the birthday ball," Miller corrected. "We saved everyone at the birthday ball," Simmons said. "The ball itself did not make it. There's a difference." Diaz laughed, wiping chocolate syrup from his sleeve, while Briggs quietly began collecting stray silverware off the floor, muttering something about proper inventory procedures that nobody was listening to. Lieutenant Harris arrived a few minutes later, somehow having found a spare clipboard in the middle of an alien invasion, already scribbling notes with the focused determination of a man trying to make sense of the impossible. He stopped in front of 2nd Platoon, looked at the wreckage, looked at Big Deborah, looked at the cake stain on Miller's jacket, and sighed. "Command is going to ask how a formal ceremony turned into a firefight," Harris said. "Tell them the enemy started it," Miller said. "They're going to ask why a ceremonial's sword was used as an actual weapon. Tell them it was very effective." Harris looked down at his clipboard, then back up at the room full of exhausted, Chocolate-covered Marines who had just repelled a Dominion boarding party using serving trays, ice buckets, a birthday bell, and one extremely stubborn ceremonial sword. He clicked his pen closed. "I'm just going to write that the cake was a total loss," Harris said. "Some things are easier to explain than others." Outside, through the broken windows, the first hint of dawn was starting to color the sky, and reinforcement units continued securing the perimeter, confirming that no further Dominion forces remained in the area. Colonel Whitfield addressed the surviving guests one last time before they were escorted to safety, his voice steady despite the long night behind him. 251 years, he said, echoing his earlier words, and not once has anything managed to cancel this ceremony completely. Tonight was close, but we're still standing, and so is the tradition. The Marines still gathered in the wrecked ballroom, raised whatever they had left in hand. Cracked champagne glasses, spare coffee mugs, one very battered ceremonial sword, and gave a tired but genuine cheer that echoed out through the broken windows into the cold morning air. Miller looked around at his platoon, bruised, exhausted, covered in chocolate and plaster dust, and allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. Somewhere out there, whatever remained of the Jakari Dominion was about to receive a very confusing report about a human ceremony that could not be stopped. Not by weapons, not by numbers, not by surprise, because whatever this species called a birthday, it apparently came with teeth. As 2nd Platoon was finally cleared to head back to barracks, Big Deborah's engines rumbled back to life one last time, lifting slightly off the ruined floor, clearly unwilling to be left behind. "Big Deborah requests permanent reassignment to 2nd Platoon," the ship announced proudly. Malone did not even look up from his coffee. Command already lost that argument once. They are not winning it twice. And as the sun rose fully over Camp Hearthstone, casting long light across a ballroom that would need months of repair and a story that would need years to fully explain, one truth had already spread through every corner of the base by breakfast. Somewhere out there, in the vast cold reaches of enemy territory, every Dominion officer was about to learn exactly why you never, under any circumstances, interrupt a Marine Corps birthday ball. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe for more, and drop a comment below telling me which part of tonight's chaos was your favorite. Share this with someone who needs a laugh, and I will see you in the next story.